Hello, everyone. It's a small group tonight, so feel free to interrupt with questions or yeah, ideas or comments as we go along. We'll have lots of room for questions at the end, but please don't hesitate to interrupt us. I think we will still introduce ourselves and the project because this is being recorded. I know most of you in the audience are familiar with us, but we'll still do that piece. Um, so yeah, we're here tonight to talk a little bit about a project called Phytoclass, learning about phytoplankton in the Gulf of Alaska through culture, language, art, and science. And tonight we're going to speak especially focus on that language piece. So my name is Katie Gavenus. I grew up in Homer, Alaska. My dad is Paul Gavenus. He's a commercial fisherman and now a boat builder. And my mom is Ginny Espenshade. She was a lawyer and now she runs a restorative justice nonprofit. They moved to Homer in the 1980s from the East Coast. My grandparents are, my one living grandparent is Ruth Gavenus, of Welsh and English descent, and then Edward Gavenus, who was a Lithuanian immigrant, and then James Espenshade and Catherine Espenshade from Western and Eastern Europe. My sister's name is Erica. I'm really proud to be her sister and an auntie to Juniper. And my husband's name is Nathan Main. He comes here from Maryland, Florida, and Washington. And I'm a stepmom to Johanna. I grew up in Homer on Denina and Sugpiaq lands, and I'm very grateful to have had the amazing opportunity to grow up in relationship with that place. And I'm really humbled to have the chance to learn from the original stewards of that place, past, present, and future. And I strive to continue to be humble and to be learning. And when I was in school and growing up, there weren't a lot of conversations happening, at least in the circles that I was part of or that my family was a part of, about Indigenous language, Indigenous presence, and Indigenous future. And so I'm really grateful to have the opportunity in a really small way to be part of those conversations now. And it's I feel very humble and very, very grateful. I also, since our discussion tonight is around plankton, I would be remiss not to acknowledge some pretty incredible mentors, some of the first people that introduced me to plankton and the ocean. So I'm really grateful to Chris and Pat Moss, who took me out on the fishing boat and kind of connected me to Kaciamak Bay for some of the first times. And then to Conrad Field and the late Carmen Field, and then also Katie Birch, who were some of the first kind of marine educators that showed me the world of plankton through the microscope. And very grateful to the place where I grew up and where I live. And I guess I should also note that I work for the Center for Alaskan Coastal Studies in Homer, one of many parts of my identity. And I'll turn it over to Dehrich.
Oyana, thank you. Tamai, Tamachpati, Angayumang, Hui Dehrich Chya, Sunamisu Matlanga, Kisin Kichahwihum Awatini Anglisanga. Hello, my name is Dehrich Chya. I was born in Kodiak, but grew up in the Anchorage area. I am Sugpiaq, Alutiiq, from Kodiak. My family comes from all over the island, but yeah, I was born in Kodiak and live there today. I work at the Alutiiq Museum. My title is the Language and Living Culture Manager. I do a lot of work with our Indigenous language, Sugtstun or Alutiiqstun, and with culture education and things like that. I'm also a member of the Kodiak Alutiiq Dancers. I've been dancing for most of my life. My family had a dance group when I was growing up, and so we would perform at like the Alaska Native Heritage Center and things like that, and traveled around a few places for that. And later on in my life, I worked at the Alaska Native Heritage Center as a dancer and got a lot of exposure to other Alaska Native cultures and Alaska Native dance through that job. And when I moved back to Kodiak after getting my bachelor's, I immediately joined the Kodiak Alutiiq Dancers to continue that. My master's is in rural development from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and as part of that, I studied Kodiak, Alutiiq, Sugpiaq place names and the meanings behind them and all of that. I started learning our language when I was, I guess it started when I was 15 or so. I went to Digafognak, which is the name of a culture camp on Kodiak Island, run by a native village of Afognak. And I went there to go teach dance. And it was like the first year that they had like a really big focus on teaching language, but also exposing participants to language. And it was the first time that I had ever been exposed to our language being spoken in like a conversational sense. I grew up dancing and everything, so I'd heard it sung and all of that, but never really heard it spoken or anything prior to that. And so that kind of inspired me to want to learn our language as well, and started my journey then. And now working at the Alutiiq Museum, it's a part of my everyday life, and I'm really glad and fortunate that I'm able to do that as part of my work. But Quiana, thanks.
So tonight we're going to do a really quick overview of this project overall. Derich's going to share some about the importance of Indigenous language and the work that he helped do with the Elder Session at the Alutiiq Museum. A little example from Digafognak, and then we recently had the opportunity to host or co-host a Sukstun and Ocean Science gathering in Homer just last week that we'll share a little bit about before we wrap up. So the focus of this project is on phytoplankton as a part of the ecosystems here in the Gulf of Alaska, and really thinking about their plankton's ecological importance and connection to culture, food, and economies. The science that it's attached to is focused on the importance of small phytoplankton in this region and some of the differences between the really big chains of phytoplankton and the small phytoplankton. But for this project, we're really trying to tie it into other relevant local projects as well. And for those that might not be familiar with phytoplankton, they are organisms that drift in the ocean, and the phyto part in this instance means that they photosynthesize like plants do on land. So they're usually small, drifting mini plants that photosynthesize in the ocean. We call them plant-like. They're not exactly plants, but they're pretty close. This project spans coastal communities in the northern Gulf of Alaska, and so far I've had the opportunity to do work in Chiniga, Afognak, Port Graham, Nanwalek, and Homer, and really excited to continue to collaborate across this region. We're going to dive into this piece around really focused on culture, language, art, and science. And so one of the key project activities is creating and implementing educational activities for youth. And this includes things like using nets to do plankton tows with students, microscope labs, a big focus on guest presenters and trying to incorporate local knowledge holders, whether that be an oyster farmer or someone who studies plankton or a commercial fisherman or someone who helps to monitor for harmful algal blooms, but really trying to incorporate local knowledge as well. Food web games, lots of outdoor learning, and more aspects kind of tailored to each class or each community. Another really fun piece is around incorporating art and doing some scientific sketching in watercolors. And then one of the tricky things about plankton is even in like English or scientific vocabulary, a lot of these plankton have very difficult to pronounce names that are just like outside of the realm of what an average human being would look at and identify with. And so a piece of this that we've been doing with kids is allowing them the opportunity to give plankton their own creative names and to describe them and to put art together in a way to become a little bit more familiar and comfortable with plankton as parts of our ecosystems. And then we're also working to create note cards, much like you might see a puffin or a salmon or a black bear or an orca on cards from a region, creating note cards that can go back out into communities that feature these super charismatic mini organisms. But I think the most exciting aspect of this project is what Derich's going to share about now.
Yeah, Koyana. So yeah, Katie brought this work to our elder session in Kodiak, I think in 2022. And we were really, happy to work on this with Katie and for the project. We meet with our elders. We try to have meetings at least once a week with elders and speakers because our language, like many other Alaska Native languages and Native American languages, is an endangered language. And so we're constantly trying to learn and document as we're learning. So we have regular meetings with our elders and speakers in Kodiak, and we were able to provide like descriptions or names for these different plankton by working with our elders and really try to approach it from the perspective of like when you look at words for animals and stuff in our language, a lot of them are quite descriptive. Like you might call a bird saquluk, which means something that has a wing, or like the word for an ermine is amidaduk, which comes from the root for like to mean really thin or skinny. So they're really descriptive, and so we kind of applied that as with these different words and worked with elders on them. So Katie introduced the project and described plankton because some of the elders had heard of and worked with, or not worked with, but had heard of plankton before and everything, but others weren't as familiar with it. So she described the different types and based on those descriptions came up with nice words in our language for them. So first for zooplankton is kumitchachwat, which means sort of like a jumping jack or beach flea. Kumitchak is our word for a beach flea, and yeah, those are all over Kodiak's beaches. The next one is Notstariyuchngaskat, or phytoplankton. And Notstariyuchngaskat means something that looks like plants. And then Gunqutstit. So this is a word that, with the help of a dictionary, we were able to remember that there's a word for when the ocean like bioluminesces. And so that word Gunqutstit means things that make the ocean light up, essentially. And so we kind of approach this to other work we do with science as well. So it's not just like, biology and things, but also being from, working at the Alutiiq Museum and Archaeological Repository. We also do a lot of archaeological work. And one of the things we're doing with language to kind of return it to the land is when our archaeologists find sites in different places around the archipelago, we also give it an Alutiiq name or description. And these are different ways that we provide names for those sites, and it's based on research that I did as part of my master's when I was studying place names and studying why our ancestors named different places the way that they were and are, and using those same reasonings in how we name archaeological sites when we discover those. So they can be based on physical characteristics like Benachdulik, or has an abundance of cliffs, proximity to other features like Jochaqiqdaq, which means faces Kodiak Island, how a site was used, Buyuhuik, a place to smoke or a smokehouse, and then named after resources a site provides, like Winachsuhuik, a place to hunt sea lions.
And so in kind of a fun connection to Derich's language experience, as part of this project, Molly Odell and Dehrich helped to connect me with the Dig-a-Fognak program or camp that happens through the native village of Afognak. and I was invited to come out and be a presenter or an activity lead for their Harvest and Survival Camp summer 2023. And so thinking about that theme of harvest and survival and plankton's role in the food web, and then also with the older students, some of these questions around ways that plankton can potentially be harmful with things like paralytic shellfish poisoning. I was able to lead a whole variety of activities within that theme. Plankton sampling, a microscope lab. We had an ID guide for plankton, and we had Dehrich was able to get me the final descriptions or names right beforehand, and so I wrote in Sharpie on the top of it, crossed out the English name, and put those names. And then because there's such a strong language component with Digafognak, I was sitting in on language classes every day and learning the alphabet, and the students were as well. And so then it was actually really fun to have them try to sound out those words and then work with some of the language teachers to figure out how to reinforce their learning around the alphabet, and to be learning alongside them was very, very exciting. We also did some of the sketching in watercolor, STEM plankton engineering challenge, and then kind of connecting it to that harvest theme especially. We were able to do intertidal exploration and go out with a local knowledge bearer one morning to do in Kaciamac Bay, this word is pronounced more like Huidach, but when I was in a Fognak, they told me that I was pronouncing it wrong for their region. So I don't know, Dehrich, if you can help me with a more Kodiak specific pronunciation for that one.
Yeah, Huidach is yeah,
okay
for how we say it.
Okay, great. So we went in search of Huidach. We actually didn't find very many, and so that led to some interesting conversations as well. And then with the older students, we had a conversation around harmful algal blooms and risk, and decisions around when to harvest, when not to harvest, and where they can get more information. That was really really generative and interesting. I also got to be a cabin co-leader, a zip line assistant, and as I already mentioned, got to sit in on language classes as well. So it was a really immersive experience, and I learned a lot and had a lot of fun, and hope to go back. I wasn't able to get my act together for last summer, but we'll be reaching out to them again soon to see about future years, because it was a really amazing experience. So recently, this project, we had a very clear path for the beginning of the language piece of this project, and working with the Alutiiq Museum and Archaeological Repository. They are incredibly organized and have a very sort of easy to navigate system for having these conversations. And Dehrich was really easy to work with to figure out okay, when do you want to come? Book your flight, we'll make it happen. And so that was the first step for language. But we recognize that there are different sort of pockets of language throughout our region, and Alutiiq and Sugpiaq are the same language at their heart, but there's a lot of regional difference, and sort of that community buy-in and just engagement in the process was important. And because the Center for Alaskan Coastal Studies is based in Lower Cook Inlet and Kaciamac Bay, it felt really important to try to create a similar opportunity for language speakers from that region to be part of this process and to identify words or descriptions that made sense to them that we could use in our region of Lower Cook Inlet. And so we just were able to have a gathering around Sukstun and ocean science in Homer this past week. And it served also a dual role of being a place to exchange knowledge and ideas and questions around some ocean science topics, specifically focused on plankton, and then on beach intertidal foods. And so we had elders from Nunwalek, so Johnny and Rhoda Moonen, and then Eugenio or Virginia Moonen and Charles Moonen, as well as Diane Selenoff from Valdez, originally from Port Graham, and Lillian Elsfuss from Homer now, Seldovia prior to Homer, and originally from the community of Port Graham. And then we also had scientists from and educators from the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve who were there and able to talk some around plankton science and intertidal research that they're doing, a plankton researcher from the Northern Gulf of Alaska, long-term ecological research, and then some folks from coastal studies, and also a younger person, Shania Tanape, originally from Nanwalek, now living in Kenai, who was also able to be there and is related to many of the elders. And there are some really cool, Shania has a pretty strong marine science background, and so there was some intergenerational sharing of knowledge that was happening from a trusted source. That was a really cool thing to see. So this is at least most of the group. There are a few people that kind of came and went over the few days. And one of the really fascinating things about this process with this group is that there was a lot of iterations and really thinking through those descriptions. So when Dehrich was talking about like descriptions for birds or ermine, there was a lot of like fine tuning descriptions around different, like, is it like this? Or is it related to this? Or does it look like this? Is it a thing that happens, or is it a being? And so there's some really fascinating conversations that happened around the language. And then there were also, at the beginning of the conversation, Lillian asked some really probing questions right at the beginning. We jumped right into like, why are we here? What are we trying to do? What is plankton? And at the beginning, there was a lot of sentiments that people were sharing around this idea that like plankton are a new problem. We didn't have to worry about these in the past. They must be related to pollution or changes. And like, oh yes, some of these type of zooplankton, pteropods showed up this summer, and that's what drove the salmon away. And so there was a lot of these kind of ideas around plankton being new in local communities and plankton being negative in local communities. And so we were able to kind of think through that and talk through that as a group and figure out like what aspects of that align with what Western science tells us, or with what traditional knowledge tells us, and what aspects of that maybe are like a little bit different than what we would expect. And by the end, a lot of the elders were talking about how they really realize like, oh, plankton are important and they've been here all along, or they've probably been here all along, but also there are changes happening and those changes are important to understand. So that progression of thought around their role in the ecosystem was really interesting to see alongside the language work. And I think it might have been harder to do if we had just been doing a scientific presentation. I'm not sure that we would have gotten to that same place of shared understanding if it was a setup like this instead of around a coffee table, thinking through what these organisms are and their role in the ecosystem in the context of being able to describe them using Sugpiaq language. So these are the descriptions that they came up with. They're still very, very much in draft form. There's a lot of continued thought and refinement around spellings, and for lack of a better word, like conjugations, what the ends of the words should look like. But I will turn it over to Dehrich to tell us a little bit more about them.
Yeah, thanks. I want to pronounce these because I think it's important that we give these words a voice, but with the disclaimer that this is not necessarily from the dialect that I speak. Our dialects from Kodiak and the Prince William Sound and Kenai Peninsula are similar, but there are also some differences as well. So I will defer to speakers from that region if any of them are mispronounced. But a lot of them are quite similar to how we would say them in Kodiak as well. The first is Imamkingwi, which means sea bugs or bugs from the sea. Then the next is Mikluchbat Sunrat, smallest newborns, Tangan Nunilngut, ones that can't be seen. And then the last is Imaq akiyach lunitan nagami, ocean lighting up in the dark.
And I think for me, one of the interesting similarities across the two places and two groups that we're working on this project is that both groups, the one sort of description or word that was really clear to them as needing to be part of this was for bioluminescent plankton, because that is something that has been observed for many, many, many generations, whereas all these other pieces haven't been observed as directly because it takes specialized tools to observe many of them. There was a lot of conversation around changing ocean color, and those of us who are like plankton educators and plankton scientists were really trying to convince people that you could definitely see plankton blooms in the water. And we didn't quite convince people of that, except with the exception of red tide, which wasn't the piece that we really wanted to be diving in depth into. But the bioluminescent piece was something that, everyone agreed, like, oh yes, there is a, for the Alutiiq speakers, there's a word for this, and it can be adapted to talk about the creature that's causing that. And then for the Sugpiaq speakers in Lower Cook Inlet, Kachemak Bay, they couldn't find a word for it, but they knew that that phenomenon had existed and that there probably was a word for it, but they couldn't find that word in their memories or in the dictionary. But they could create a description of that phenomenon, and it was that was probably the most in-depth part of the process. Is there was this very long description in English about it's the thing that happens at the end of the summer or in the fall, at night in the dark, not just in the evening, when a boat is moving through the water, disrupting it at high speeds in the ocean. So it's like this very, very detailed description that then they tried to figure out, okay, what are the pieces that will communicate that best in Sugpiaq? So it really illuminated, no pun intended, but it really illuminated for me this piece around like the depth of the knowledge and the relationship to place that is revealed in language, even in new or kind of like adapted and evolving language. That was really cool to see. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
Nope, nothing from me.
Okay, well then we are going to say Koyana Sinak. Did I do okay? Perfect. He kind of had to say that, right? To the Elders Session at the Alutiiq Museum and Archaeological Repository. And I don't know how I forgot to mention this, but Chugach Heritage Preservation was a key partner in that Sugpiaq language gathering that just happened, with help from Mark Hrutzka, who wasn't able to be there, but then Angelina Royal, who stepped in for him. And again, to Rhoda and Johnny Moonen, Charlie and Eugenia Moonen, Diane Selenoff and Lillian Elsfas, and to Chugach Regional Resources Commission. There's a wealth of Alutiiq Sugpiaq language resources here. If you want more, talk to Dehrich afterwards. And then many thanks to the communities, tribes, organizations, and schools that have welcomed the project in to do plankton education, and really hope that we can find some ways to connect to Cordova communities and schools as well. Thank you to the Strom Lab at Western Washington University, the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and the Northern Gulf of Alaska Long-Term Ecological Research for science support on this project, and our funders. But please reach out to us. Here's our emails. You can't contact us any other way. No, just kidding. Y'all know how to get in touch with us if you have any questions. But you also can email us if you'd like